Hey everyone. So for this week's materials, we're going to be comparing two different views about environmental change and about human impacts on the environment. Part of the lesson, and one of our goals here for this week, is to recognize how arguments are influenced by their assumptions and by their starting points about how the world works. Your assigned reading includes the lecture notes that go along with this video. So I suggest reading those lecture notes first and then diving into the textbook. The textbook is going to be links to the e-textbook that we get through the library. And the first chapter to read is going to be Chapter 7, Political Economy. That's from Environment and Society, the book that's assigned for our class. And then the second chapter is going to be Chapter 2, called Population and Scarcity. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So read through Chapter 7. It's going to be a little bit long, but you can make it through it. It's not too difficult, but it is going to take you a little bit of time to go through. And hopefully the video and my lecture notes going to help you understand what's going on here in the chapter. Okay, the social environmental approach called political ecology that we introduced last time, well, it's based in part on a larger subject called political economy. And that's what this chapter deals with. And we're going to look at what that subject and what its assumptions are and how it looks at the world. Political economy is an approach to studying economy and government as an integrated subject, that economies and governments are dependent upon one another in order to function. So, for example, it starts from the starting point, I should say, is that economies are dependent on the government. They don't function, or they function because of the government. This is in contrast to other approaches which see government and economy as sort of separate or maybe even oppositional in nature. This chapter explains a political economy argument. And so this one, in particular, how it relates to the environment for our course, it centers the economy as a driver of environmental change. Specifically, its point is that the ways that capitalist economies function causes environmental problems. And we do have to get in a few minutes to what does the word capitalist mean and what does the word capitalism mean. So we're going to define that in a very specific way here in just a few minutes. So political economy, at its core, the argument from this perspective is that overaccumulation causes environmental crisis as well as economic crisis. All right, your textbook is going to go into what's called the first and second contradictions of capitalism, which is a way to say that crisis is built into the capitalist type of economy. All right, so all this talking about capitalism and capitalists is because we specify that as a particular type of economy. Instead of just calling it the economy, we have to refer to the specific formation of this kind of economy, of the dominant type of economy that's throughout the world today. Okay, so the point here is that crisis, I should say, that crisis is a feature of a capitalist economy. It's not something that happens by accident or by mistake. This is a contrasting argument compared to other viewpoints, such as market-based approaches that we'll talk about at the end of this video, which stem from the theory of neoclassical economics, where crisis, it results from the market not functioning properly. So let's get into a couple of terms here that you're going to see in the chapter. Okay, maybe the first one, just to get just settle any questions about, it's going to be the M word. Okay, Marx. All right, Karl Marx. What we're talking about here, the textbook brings up Marx quite a bit in some of its explanations here. And you should know that the writings of Karl Marx in the 19th century were mainly about capitalism. I know that in pop culture and maybe some of the in like history or social studies that we learned growing up, that it tends to be associated with communism and socialism and those sorts of things. But the bulk of his work was an analysis of capitalism. And so it was a way of explaining how capitalist businesses and capitalist economies work. So that's what the textbook is drawing on. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of that part of what's going on in the textbook. So some terminology that's going to come up in the chapter that you'll be learning. One of those terms is overaccumulation. Okay, and in a political economy perspective, overaccumulation is what causes environmental change and environmental destruction. So let's get into what that means. So if we have overaccumulation, then what's accumulation? Well, accumulation is the process of creating, controlling, and moving and using capital. Okay, capital, this is the root word for capitalism. So, capital, what's that? Well, capital is money and equipment and tools and things that businesses use to create even more money. So, that's everything that people use on their through the course of their work in order to make more money. So this involves money, but also the computers that we work on, the tools, equipment that's in factories, everything. Accumulation of capital is necessary to the function of a capitalist economy. It's part, that's how it works. It gives capitalist businesses a reason to exist. You exist because you have an input, you produce something, a good or a service or some kind of product. And then at the end of all of that, you sell it, and then you end up with more money than what you started with. A key part of this process is that capital is in circulation. It's not just that there's an input and an output that results in more capital at the end, but that capital is constantly circulated, that the capital at the end of that process gets reinvested and put back into the economy and gets used to produce even more money. And this is some of the basis for things that if you've ever had an economics course, or maybe if you pay attention to stock market news and that sort of thing, that when the talk is of economic growth, that we want to have increasing growth, that the economy is intended to have growth, right? So this is where all of those sort of basic ideas of our modern capitalist economies come from. Well, how accumulation works is in a political economy argument, what gets the attention is that as more and more capital gets accumulated, and it goes to the owners, right? The people who own the companies and who invest in companies. As this happens, then wealth tends to become more concentrated in those owners and those investors' hands. This leads to then something called overaccumulation. Overaccumulation leads to crisis because products and money at some point can no longer circulate the way that they once did. That process of capital accumulation and circulation and going back into the economy, making things, selling things, buying things, that whole process starts to slow down. It might not stop. It might not come to a stop. Sometimes it just is a little bit slower than it once was. And this results in a big problem. And now what happens? Well, either there's just too much stuff to buy, or people can't afford what's for sale. So the book, here's a quote from the book. Each product that is not sold or bought represents a value that is no longer circulating through the system. This leads to wage cuts, layoffs, and searching for cheaper and more efficient natural resources. So for example, it's cheaper and more efficient to clear cut a large forest and then destroy it than it is to selectively harvest a few trees from forests here and there, the same amount of trees, but just from many different forests, and keep those forests intact. Clear cutting a large forest is less money and it's more efficient. However, the forest gets destroyed. So these are the things that the drive to increase returns on investment ultimately leads to social and environmental crisis. And this is what gets paid a lot of attention to in a political economy approach. That's one way of understanding this point of view. All right, so let's talk about some definitions. So we need to get some things out of the way because you probably bring your own definitions into it that you've learned over the years in school or just by watching the news or all sorts of things. So let's bring in some definitions so that we're all on the same page. So I'm drawing on some information here from the Dictionary of Human Geography. And so, for example, capitalism is defined as a specific form of economic organization where labor and capital are central to the operation. And specifically, it means that there's a separation between workers or labor from the means of production. In other words, tools, equipment, et cetera, the things that you use for your work. All right. So in other words, the workers or the employees of a company don't own the thing that they do in the company. So factory workers don't own the machines of the factory. Somebody who works in an office doesn't own the computer, on the computers, the business furniture, those sorts of things. So the way that people get their work done is owned by the company, and then the employees don't own any part of that. So that sort of distinction there is a central characteristic of what a capitalist business is. All right, the other distinction is that the owners of all of that equipment are the ones who get to decide what to do with the returns or the profits or the sales or the income, that sort of thing. Okay, so one thing we might not, in our definitions here, and among most human geography definitions, profits or earning money or cash, that's not a unique capitalist characteristic. You can make profits in any sort of non-capitalist economy. Even in communist Soviet Union, there were profits that were being made when things were sold for more than they were bought, more than they were produced for. Okay, so one of the central characteristics is the difference between the waged employees and the owners of the means of production, right? So that's some of the vocabulary. Okay, some other characteristics of capitalism would be private property and free markets, right? So these are two secondary characteristics, but they sort of derive themselves from that separation between labor and capital. All right, so let's go on and talk about some of the assumptions within a political economy argument. Like any sort of perspective or point of view, it's built on certain assumptions about how the world works, or assumptions about what to pay attention to and what is important. So one assumption in political economy is that capitalism is inherently going to have a crisis, and it's going to happen. And it's not a mistake, but it's built into that kind of economy. Okay, and the reason for this, and from a political economy perspective, is because of the exploitation of workers. And exploitation is a specific word here. That's not my word. That's like specifically chosen. Exploitation is used in this perspective because, well, it's assumed that the ultimate source of value, in other words, where does value come from? Like economic value, and ultimately profits. The ultimate source of value in a business comes from the work that workers do. It doesn't come from the investors or from shareholders or from the owners of a company, but in that perspective, the source of value comes from the workers. In other words, people from this perspective would argue that without the workers, the company will not do anything. And that the workers could make stuff on their own without lots of input from investors. They might just have to go about it differently. But investors and the owners of capital wouldn't be able to do anything without the workers coming into work. So that's one of the key central points here, or starting points. Okay, where the exploitation comes in is that in order to make a profit, workers have to be underpaid relative to the value of the work that they do. All right, so here's where the assumption comes in. If all value, as in all profits, if the source of that value is from the work that the employees do, then in order for that to be a profit, then the workers have to be underpaid. All right, if this doesn't make so much sense, we'll get into that maybe in a couple of weeks when we start talking about different kinds of businesses. Okay, the environmental part of all this comes in because natural resources often bears the impacts of the drive to accumulate profits. The housing crisis, right, and the Great Recession, 2008, 2010, right, this time period was at the end of a big housing boom. Okay, that was an example of overaccumulation. There was a lot of capital being sunk into housing. There was this big construction boom, and then there wasn't anybody able to buy it, right? And there's a lot of things. It's a very complicated situation, but a lot of people from political economy perspective would see this as some evidence of another example of a crisis caused by overaccumulation. That what happened was there was a lot of capital being sunk into housing, and people weren't able to buy it for various reasons. Some of this had to do with subprime loans and predatory lending and things like that. But at the end of the day, the capital couldn't be recirculated. It was stuck. People weren't buying the houses weren't being finished being built, and it was stuck. And that caused the crisis, right? Or that didn't cause the crisis, but that was what triggered the crisis to happen. And so we might think about not only what happened to people in the Great Recession, but what also happened to the environment, that all of those raw materials, the wood, the lumber, the petroleum, the cement that was used for all of this construction, it just sort of sat there and nothing got done with it. And it was all done not really to meet the needs of a population, but it was really done to meet the needs of a circulation of capital. Well, let's talk about some limitations of this approach too, because that's good to kind of see their assumptions and the starting point, some limitations. Well, one limitation of a political economy approach is that it has the risk of reifying the economy. That's basically a fancy way of saying that if we talk about it as this big system, then it becomes a big system and an unstoppable force that we have no control over. All right. And so that's something that we talk about more when we start getting into the diverse economies approach here starting next week and then the coming weeks. All right. Another thing that comes along with political economy is that it really centers formal wage labor as really the only kind of economic activity that's part of the discussion. And it sort of ignores a lot of unpaid work or informal work that happens all around the world that actually vastly outnumbers in terms of time and in terms of value that's generated, maybe not monetary value, but in terms of the value generated through that work, sort of ignores all of that stuff. And we're going to get into that in the coming weeks also. Skip backwards, go to chapter 2, population and scarcity. This chapter talks about what we're going to call an eco-scarcity argument. Eco-scarcity argument is something that you're all probably familiar with because it's very common. It sort of filters into almost any sort of environmental discussion that you might have come across, and it's become a very common sense sort of way of looking at the world. And that's what we're going to try to unpack here with this chapter and with the notes in the video here. So eco-scarcity tends to come from this idea that population growth drives environmental change. And I want to say it right off the bat that population growth has consistently and historically actually been a very poor predictor of environmental change. It doesn't really correlate that well. Now, you might be asking yourself, why do we keep hearing about it? Like, why does everybody talk about it? It's a great question. People from political ecology, training, and education and experience are really baffled by this. And some of those reasons why it's seems to be such a common sense thing is that, well, it's a very easy way out, right? We don't really have to think about some questions that are really tough. Like political economy brings up some tough things to really consider. For example, like, well, we'll get into that stuff later and you'll see it in the book. All right, well, let's get back to our chapter at hand and what you're going to read about. Okay, so central to an eco-scarcity argument is that population growth drives environmental change, right? We hear this a lot, right? So for example, more people are going to mean there's more cars on the road, more consumption of natural resources and so on. And we get vocabulary like carrying capacity that you might have learned about in a biology class or in some other kind of class, right? That suggests that there's limits to population growth. That's not sustainable. Okay, so this argument, you need to know that this argument got its start. It's been around for a long time, for a couple of hundred years. It got its start around the same time that capitalism was in its early stages. Yes, we're going back talking about capitalism again. And you're going to see in just a few minutes how this all connects together. All right, so the argument really started coming together in the late 1700s and early 1800s. In Britain, right, in England, this is where a lot of big changes were started. It was no accident that this was all happening at the same time in the same place. All right, assumption. Let's go into some assumptions about this argument about population growth. Eco-scarcity arguments are based ultimately and historically really on the propositions of someone named Thomas Malthus, right? And there's some other people that came right maybe like before him that has some similar ideas, but he probably had the biggest impact right almost at the end of the 1700s, the turn of the the 1800s, right at the beginning of the 19th century, he wrote a very influential publication where he argued that population is going to outpace the food production of the world. All right, that's kind of some of the mechanics there of his argument. Population is going to grow exponentially, and thus it's going to outpace or outgrow agricultural productivity. And that as a result of that, there's going to be famine, there's going to be starvation, there's going to be food shortages, that sort of thing. That's what it was. All right, his arguments. Now, let's unpack some of the assumptions. The arguments were not based on environmental data, not really based on any kind of data at all, really, except kind of observations about overcrowded conditions in England. And in a few minutes, we're going to see why were there overcrowded conditions in England. All right. So they were really based on political and economic views that he had. Specifically, Malthus, he was targeting British government support of poor people, right? Today we would call this things like public education, social services, food assistance, welfare, social security, Medicare, etc. All right, in England, there were some things for actually the past few hundred years called poor laws. All right, so poor laws were intended to just basically provide like kind of an ancient form of welfare and that sort of thing. And they underwent some changes in the 1700s, around the same time that the economy was really switching from a feudalism to a capitalism type of economy. So at that time in Britain, capitalism was getting started. There was also a steep rise in poverty and overcrowded conditions. Lots of bad things were happening that the country and the world hadn't really experienced before. So the government was providing assistance to poor people. All right, Malthus opposed those resources for the poor. That's where all of the population growth argument ultimately stems from. Every single argument or point about population, as populations grow, that's going to cause the environment to change. It all comes down to Malthus wanting the British government to stop providing assistance to the poor. It was an economic agenda that he had. It wasn't about the environment. Okay, that's really what it came down to. A close reading, and I've read the book before that he wrote, and it's very clear if you get into that. His solution was that if poor people decrease their population growth, then the government wouldn't need to provide those resources, and that if the poor didn't receive resources such as education, food, housing, etc., then they would have less children. So his result was to stop providing resources to the poor, and therefore the population would go down. So he specifically also called for example, for poor women to exercise quote unquote moral restraint and so that they would have less children. So this goal was linked also to a kind of a poor understanding of the environment. For example, he kind of was assuming that soil had a fixed amount of food that it could grow. And if you learned anything about things like gardening or agriculture, we know that we can put fertilizer into soil and it can replenish the soil. You know, there's some arguments about that it might not be too sustainable if it's kind of artificial fertilizer. Well, let's take that one step further and we can compost our green waste and we can replenish the soil fertility that way too, right? So that's part of another sort of shortcoming of that argument. So a very important part of Malthus's argument was that denying resources and aid for the poor, and not just things like welfare, but also education, right? Denying the poor resources would result in lower population growth, and thus it would help improve food security for everyone else. So looking back on that, of course, and your book is going to go into this, like, of course, populations exert pressures on the environment, right? But it's not really to the extent that it's made out to be by these arguments. And it's also really important to understand why was this argument being made in the first place, and that it was a political and economic argument rather than an environmental one. And so while populations have, grown over time, right? The world population has increased. Growth rates are no longer exponential. And also agricultural productivity has exceeded population growth. So that negates two of the core parts of what's now called Malthusianism, right? So Malthusianism is that sort of overpopulation kind of approach to things. So data has shown also that when poor people have access to additional resources such as food, housing, education, healthcare, etc., population growth actually decreases. So providing additional resources for the poor reduces population growth instead of causing population growth. So let's talk about a couple of things that your textbook brings up, like maybe could population really be an effect of other things rather than a cause of things? So a couple of things. First one's kind of short. Second one going to be a longer example. So first, check out chapter 2. There's an example from Kerala, India, about the relationship between poverty, resources, population growth, and women's rights and education and things like that. It really sort of contrasts the cause and effect assumptions of an eco-scarcity argument. And in particular, it kind of flipped all of that argument backwards. And it showed that women were given access to education and healthcare, and population growth went down, that sort of thing. All right, so let's look back at the context of Malthus to see what was the situation when these arguments were being formed. So we can learn a lesson from London, England, and we can examine the geographical reasons for population growth there a couple hundred years ago or more. Population increased in London dramatically from 1700s to the 1800s. Like it really increased a lot. A big reason for that was people moving to London from elsewhere. Why? Well, part of that might be the British Empire, and then the empire covered, most of the world. And then people were moving to England and Britain from elsewhere in search of work. Okay, we're going to look at more detail on another issue that was happening, which is that people moving from the countryside in England in search of work. So here, what we're going to look at is that a big reason is that of population growth in London was that English people, some of them had no choice but to move from rural England to London for in search of a livelihood after what was called the enclosures. All right, enclosures was this process and went over a few hundred years actually, but it was a process in England where land was converted into private property. All right, private property, we think of that as sort of a normal state of how property works, but it's actually kind of a new thing. Private property is a kind of, in terms of human society, is somewhat recent invention. So enclosures in England was the process where shared land was converted into private property by literally enclosing it and putting stone walls around the countries on pieces of the countryside. So this had to do with the full name of this is called the enclosures of the commons. So the commons were pastures where people called commoners took turns grazing their livestock, sheep, cows, goats, whatever, etc. That's where the word commoner comes from, not because they're plain or common, but because they use commons, a type of property. So the pastures were shared by the community. And this is where people really made their livelihoods, especially during the Middle Ages up until the 1800s. They had a way to kind of own their own means of production, right? Going back to that word from the political economy section. They had access to land. They had access to livestock. It was kind of their own stuff. They get to have their food to eat. If they slaughtered some livestock, you also could cut the wool off of sheep and have their own clothing, that sort of thing, right? So that's kind of what we're going through. What we're kind of starting point here is, okay, in the years as feudalism shifted to capitalism, and, I'm not sort of making a great claim about feudalism. Of course, there was tons of bad stuff about that. But what I'm talking about here is how regular people had access to tools and land and resources to support their livelihoods. All right, the years as feudalism shifted to capitalism, sheep farming suddenly became a profitable business. The shift wasn't just the feudalism, and there was a space in between there called mercantilism that we don't need to get into. All right, but the point here in this section is that sheep industry, the wool industry, okay, needed to increase the speed of wool production, because what is one of our characteristics of capitalism is that there has to be an accumulation cycle of capital. Invest capital, put it to work, sell things, take the investments, put it back into the process, and have this cycle of capital circulate increasingly. So wool had to become turned into capital. So enclosures happened because those who had power over land, ruling classes, that sort of thing, aristocrats, began enclosing those pastures. They built stone walls around them and excluded commoners from using them. And private property, one of its essential characteristics is the right to exclude other people. So sheep belonging to wool industry businessmen were grazed intensively until all that grass was eaten. Then they moved on to another enclosure and then grazed until all of that place was completely eaten, and then moved on to another enclosure. This was a very efficient way to produce a lot of wool really quickly. It was great for the wool industry, right? You could have a lot of sheep in one place together. You could harvest them. They're not spread all over the place. You don't have to spend all day getting your chasing down the sheep or whatever. It's fast, right? And you have them all. It's very efficient. Great for the wool industry, but efficiency, as we're going to find out, sometimes, or maybe a lot of times, it's bad for people and bad for the environment. Under the managed commons before enclosure, sheep were shifted often to new areas around the area so that they didn't overgraze any one particular area. And again, the wool that was being grown on sheep was to really make clothes for yourself. And maybe if a family or a household wanted to sell some of the wool, they could sell some of it. But it wasn't really it wrapped up in a cycle of capital accumulation. After the enclosures, sheep had no choice but to overgraze. They were confined to smaller areas. It was the most efficient way for wool production to have the sheep completely graze a pasture until all the grass was gone, down to the soil. Enclosures were not just bad for the environment, they were also socially destructive. And this was starting to be evident way back even in the 1500s. Thomas More wrote a book in 1516 called Utopia, really about what happened after these enclosures, about the change in land access and how people lost access to land. And he wrote about homelessness and starvation, and that was caused by the enclosures of the commons. So as nobility enclosed the commons to increase economic growth through sheep farming, people were denied access to land. So what we're going to talk about here, let's fast forward to the 1800s. Push and pull forces are bringing people to London. There's the Industrial Revolution. There's this new kind of thing called a factory. A factory is meant to just build stuff in order to sell things and then keep building stuff and making more things. This is really different than the old, in the Middle Ages, where somebody would go to the blacksmith and say, can you make some horseshoes? And they would make the horseshoes and that would be it. The factory is just going to make stuff, whether or not somebody's gone to buy them. They're going to make all this stuff in advance. All right. And so the factories needed people to work in them. They also needed natural resources in order to make all that stuff. The newly formed working class, which is also kind of a new thing that resulted from all these changes, right? They're kind of made up of all the descendants of all the peasants who lost their land back during the enclosures. So they were kind of really pushed out of the countryside because there wasn't really a way to make a livelihood if they didn't have anywhere to graze their sheep and that sort of thing. They're also pulled into the cities by the need to find wage jobs in order to earn money for survival. The only way that they could survive was to make money. It's a situation where all of us today kind of take for granted, as this is how the world works. You need to have a job just in order to pay rent and buy food, right? This is sort of a characteristic of our current system that we're in. The urban populations took off. This is the London that happened. This is the Charles Dickens era of talking and writing about how bad London was. Disease, malnutrition also increased because in the early 19th century, there were no regulations or public services regarding things like safe water supply or sanitation. So some pretty bad things happened in cities around that time, for example, London and even Paris. So 1830s, the urban death rates, of course, they were taking off. Urban population was taking off, but also urban death rates were also taking off and rising dramatically. Diseases related to things like cholera, which are transmitted through contaminated water, just kills thousands and thousands of people. Okay, across the British Channel over in France, by the time we get all the way up to the 1870s, Well, the French have had enough and they start a revolution and they create something called the Paris Commune in protest of this new economic system that they don't really like so much. So let's go back over to Britain, and reformers in Britain kind of recognize the situation is not too good, and that they're thinking that in order to maintain a healthy workforce and maybe to stop revolutions, the government's going to need to step in to provide some basic services and education. All right, so this is the geographic and historical context in which Thomas Malthus developed his theory of overpopulation and eco-scarcity. So when you put this into this context, hopefully you can see how he formed his arguments, right? The time that he was in, that there were these rising populations, and that he had an economic agenda, right? Then that's probably a good way to put it. That there was an agenda of how government would be spending its money. But also, why was population rising in the first place? That in this context that we just went through, hopefully we can see that London's population growth was an effect of environmental change, and it was an effect of economic change. It wasn't a cause of environmental change. It was an effect of things like enclosures that had happened in years past. It was an effect of lack of job opportunities. It was an effect of very poor social services and sanitation and housing conditions and things like that, rather than being a cause of food shortages. Okay, let's start wrapping up here. What about some other perspectives? We're really just looking at two things here this week, but I can quickly maybe let's talk about a third one. You don't have to read it in the textbook. You can if you want to. It's chapter 3. It explains market approaches. So this is things like free market solutions to environmental issues. Okay, so market solutions are based primarily in neoclassical economic theory, which assumes that free market operating under the right conditions is going to generate optimal outcomes for people and for the environment. All right, and I'll go into maybe one part of this, right? So there's something called the Coase theorem, C-O-A-S-E, Coase, named after an economist named, forget his first name, but Mr. Coase, Professor Coase. All right, the Coase theorem is a prominent argument from the market approach. And its point is that pollution and environmental degradation, things like that, could be controlled through contracts between property owners. Again, private property is one of the main features of capitalism, and neoclassical economics tends to go from the starting point that capitalism is the ideal economic system. So chapter 3 gives the example of conflict between cattle ranchers and homeowners in Montana. Homeowners might complain about the noise, smell, and pollution from the nearby cattle ranch. All right, from the book, let's read a little bit. How can such a situation be regulated? Okay, well, maybe the government might step in and ban cattle ranching. Maybe the government says homeowners have to do this. Maybe housing developments are going to be regulated that have to be built in a certain way. Maybe some soundproof housing is going to be put in terms with the building code. Okay, none of those might be really fair to one side or the other, and it might not be very efficient either. And with market solutions, efficiency is the name of the game. All right, so who pays for all this stuff, right? So with our market solutions approach, none of those things would really work, right? That's not how you would do things. So in the market solution approach, it would be better to let the two parties sort out the problems through contracts, and in that process, discover the real cost and values of ranching, cattle smells, mountain views, whatever. Okay, contracts between two property owners, right? So let's get into the assumptions here. So what is the assumptions here? What's the basis of this argument? For this argument to work, two things have to happen. One, the ranchers and the homeowners must have the full ability to control their land and to make decisions about their land and their property. Okay, two, and importantly, their negotiations and contracts must not cost anything. The contract, all of that stuff has to cost no money in order to negotiate, write, and enforce. Right? Those are the assumptions. If you are familiar with anything about the legal system, we know that in real life, that never happens. Contracts, negotiation, anything involving the legal system is never free. Okay, it always costs something. It also involves a very big government apparatus to do all of this stuff. Contracts, negotiations, all that sort of thing never exists outside of a pretty large government structure. That's where all of this stuff is done. So that involves taxes, government revenues, and that sort of thing. Okay, another thing that may be really important for the environment is that property rights need to be available for all things in order for this thing to work, in order for this approach to work. Property rights, including nature, because that's how contracts are made and enforced according to a market approach. It includes environmental resources like air. So, for example, to solve the cattle ranch problem in a market-based approach, air must be owned by someone who paid for it, who can get value for it, and who has additional individual interest in keeping it clean. How do you buy the air? I don't know. There's a movie from the 1980s called Spaceballs where there actually was air that was being sold in cans. Sounds kind of silly, but when we think about how there's bottled water today, maybe it's not too far off. But one way that this the giving property rights to air has actually happened is through things called cap and trade programs. All right, so cap and trade programs are one way that private property has been extended into the air. So how this works is companies buy air pollution credits and offset their emissions by paying companies in other places to reduce their emissions over there. So for example, let's say there's factory A in one place needs to reduce its emissions by 300 tons. Maybe they have their own goal that they set, or maybe there is a government regulation that said that they need to reduce their emissions. So cap and trade works that factory A buys pollution credits from factory B. Factory B is somewhere else. Maybe it's on the other side of the world. Maybe it's in a different part of the country. They're going to reduce their emissions over there. So factory A might not even reduce their air pollution at all, or maybe they reduce it just a little. The overall result globally is that between the two factories, emissions went down. An issue with this has to do, if you're a geography student, hopefully you can recognize that one issue with cap and trade is that local geography is ignored. Even if total emissions were reduced globally, the location of the pollution could still be concentrated in certain places. This is an issue that needs people trained in geography to be working on. It also brings up things like environmental justice and some of the ways that if we look at a map of where pollution and environmental hazards are located, it tends to be an environmental justice issue. And it doesn't just get evened out if we look at sort of an equation, a worldwide equation. So what's next? Well, read the 2 chapters for more detail. There's gonna check out Canvas for any other activities to do. And I hope you enjoyed the content here this week. Hopefully I made it a little bit straightforward here with the video and with my lecture notes as you get into the textbook. All right, great. Thanks. See you later.